The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
Okay, if everybody could take their seats, please. Go ahead and stay on schedule. So next we have Colonel Kyle Solomon, who serves as the Commandant of the Canadian Army Command and Staff College, and he's going to lead our second panel on the Great Powers in the High North. His full biography can be found online and on the CACSC website.
Good morning, everybody, and I'll surprise people by saying good evening as well, because we have panelists joining us from around the world and also other members of the conference. So this is panel number 2. The title is Great Powers in the High North. So for the next 90 minutes, I'm going to start by introducing our first panelists. They'll get up and speak for about 15 minutes. Then we'll transition and we'll go online, and we'll have one of our panelists join us from Denmark. So I'll provide a quick introduction for her, and then we'll transition again back to in-person. I'll provide the third of our introductions to our panelists, and then we'll transition to a Q&A period for the last portion of the session. So this panel is going to look at the re-emergence of great power competition and how it's affecting regional politics in all areas of the globe, and highlight great power interests in the North. So we had a terrific lead-in from the last panel to our discussion. It'll examine the circumpolar security policies of the United States. We'll look at the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, and European powers. We'll then move our discussion closer to home and look at both U.S. and Canadian interests in the Arctic. And so I'll try and tie these 3 stories together. And so we're going to start with the Canadian and U.S. context with our first co-presenters. So I'd like to start by introducing our first co-presenters who will discuss Canada-U.S. security cooperation in the Arctic and the importance of soft power tools. So Dr. Kathryn Friedman is a North American Arctic Policy Advisor at the U.S. DoD Ted Stevens Centers for Arctic Security Studies. As well, she's a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars within the Canada Institute. Kathryn is joined for this presentation by Lori Leffler, welcome, who's the Special Advisor to the Dean at the School of Arctic and Climate Studies at the U.S. DoD Ted Stevens Centers for Arctic Security. Please join me in welcoming our first panelists.
Just turn this on. Is it on? Oh, hello. Can you hear me? You can hear me. Okay, great. Great. Well, good morning, and thank you, Kyle. And I'd like to thank the organizers for asking Lori and I to present to you today. Before I get into the substance of our presentation, I have to provide the following. The views expressed are personal and do not reflect the official government view of the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Defense Security Cooperation Agency, the U.S. Defense Security Cooperation University, U.S. Northcom, or the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Security Studies. We have a lot of people we need to report to, so I just want to make sure that it's understood that the views that we express are our own. So with that being said, can I click here? Here. Oh, right there. Okay, great. All right. So as Brigadier General Burkhead and Dr. von Hlotke remarked this morning, as well as the first panel, we are truly witnessing significant geopolitical, military, economic, environmental risks that are ushering in a new era of strategic competition in the Arctic. Obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine resulted in Finland and Sweden taking steps to join NATO. As mentioned earlier, the Arctic Council has frozen cooperation between Russia and the remaining Arctic 7 members. Many of you know Professor Ron Hubert, who has noted that Russia has also been engaging in various Cold War behaviors, air and sea incursions in the sovereign waters and airspace of all northern states, including Canada's far north. we have that, and these risks are colliding with climate change impacts, where we are witnessing non-Arctic states such as China jockeying for influence or outright control over natural resources and certain critical minerals. We also are witnessing climate change impacts that are threatening the way of life of Arctic indigenous peoples. Again, heard quite a bit about that this morning. And these impacts are posing significant human, food, and water security challenges to people who live in the Arctic. So for Lori and me, we specifically looked at these dynamics, and we framed our article and our presentation today in the following manner. What do these dynamics mean for North American interests, and specifically Canada and the United States? And as I was listening to the presentation this morning, it dawned on me that, quite frankly, the way that we framed our remarks and our article may actually be verification of Dr. Greaves's observations regarding the Arctic being divided into three regions or three subregions. So what do these dynamics mean for the North American Arctic? What tools do the United States and Canada have to address Arctic security challenges? And how might the United States strengthen collaboration and cooperation with Canada to face these challenges? Our proposal or our pitch, if you will, or our thesis is that a smart power strategy under the umbrella of security cooperation offers potential for a North American approach to meeting current and future Arctic challenges. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to define or tell you what we think smart power means and how we are viewing security cooperation. We know that there's another panel on security devoted solely to security cooperation during this conference. So I want to make clear how we are approaching the issue. So smart power. So all of us here, security and defense officials, international relations experts, international lawyers, strategists, and others, we are all fundamentally interested in power, the ability to affect others, to obtain what we want. We are looking at power as defined and deconstructed by Joseph Nye, who did some of the most seminal work in this area of smart power. So, very, very briefly, he looked at hard power and defined it as the ability to coerce, right? It's military and economic might. He then defined soft power, right? Soft power arises from the attractiveness of a country's cultures and values and institutions. So in his view, soft power was the ability to entice and attract. And then so for Professor Nye, smart power is obviously a combination of both hard power and soft power. It's the capacity of a nation state to combine elements of both in mutually reinforcing ways so that a state's purposes are advanced effectively and efficiently. And I just want to note that, for those of you who may not realize it, I think we all understand and know what hard power is. In our view, soft power is real power. It's just a different way of exercising power. And as evidence of that, if you took a look at the DoD's 2021 Interim National Security Strategy Guidelines, that document is loaded with soft power terminology. So it's a real thing, and it is, getting to this on the next slide, it's very much a cornerstone of U.S. defense strategy and really seen as a tool of first resort in U.S. foreign policy. It's a critical component of smart power. So Canada-U.S. security cooperation, according to the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, security cooperation is building the capacity of foreign partners to encourage and enable them to respond to shared challenges. Security cooperation is a tool of first resort. Smart power is a tool of first resort, both of which are viewed by the Department of Defense as integral in a North American approach to the Arctic. Lori.
So good morning, good afternoon. Am I supposed to say good evening also?
Certainly.
Good evening, everyone. So I'm just going to touch again real quickly on what Kathryn said about smart power and security cooperation and the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, DSCA. Because it's important that we hear that before we move into what we're doing and what we might do. She mentioned building our foreign partners' capacity to respond to individual and shared challenges. It's those shared challenges. And as she mentioned, we really believe it should be one of the first tools in our toolbox. It combines our military alliances. When we look at the United States and Canada, it combines our government agencies. When we look at whole of government, specifically in the United States, security cooperation is just not the Department of Defense. It is the State Department. It is USAID. We bring in non-government organizations. We bring in academia. And as Michelle spoke earlier, our indigenous communities. Much of what she talked about, having those relationships with those people living in the high north, that is security cooperation because we're working with them in the beginning. And really, security cooperation makes the United States and Canada stronger. It makes our relationship stronger, and it helps us to move towards the future. So Kathryn talked about hard power and soft power, and hard power being our military might. We all know NORAD. We know what it is. We know what it's about. It's been here since 1945, and it really, one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is there are a lot of military-to-military engagements with NORAD. And the good news is that we are investing in the future. So both the United States, both Canada, have invested money in order to take NORAD to where we need to go. We're modernizing our capabilities. We actually have instituted, or we are instituting, a science and technology program as part of NORAD. So again, the security cooperation, not just our military component, but bringing our scientists into the network, bringing our academia into the network to help us move to the future. And really, NORAD is, as far as we know, the only binational command in the world. So what right there does that say about our relationship to protect our homeland, but also our Arctic community? And there are three that I'm just going to touch on real quick when we get to the hard power, and that's the Canada-U.S. Permanent Joint Board, the PJBD. Say that like 3 times really fast. I can't. It's representatives of the Department of Defense, so the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Homeland Security, and the Canadian Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Public Affairs. These folks engage at the policy level. They have a direct relationship, or they have a direct venue to the President and to the Prime Minister. And also with that organization is the Canada-U.S. Military Coordination Committee, otherwise known as the MCC. And they only meet biannually, though. They report to the other organization, but there's really a lot of opportunity to do a lot more with that when we look at hard power. And then you bring all of that together, and it's the Tri-Command. So you're looking at NORAD, you're looking at NORTHCOM, you're looking at the Canada Joint Northern Command, and what we're using for our hard power efforts with that. And I'm sure everybody is familiar with the U.S. Foreign Military Sales Program. We call it FMS. It's also managed by the Defense Security Cooperation Agency. And it really supplies our international partners and our allies with military equipment, military training, actually. And when we look specifically at our U.S.-Canada relationship, equipment to upgrade your CF-18s and your fighter jets. So that's all through the Foreign Military Sales Program. And some of the good news about the Foreign Military Sales Program is that it's closely monitored. One of the things we hear a lot in the United States when you talk about supplying other nations, other partners with equipment, who's getting that and where is it ending up? As part of our security cooperation network and our abilities there, we have end-to-end use monitoring. So we know where it's going, we know what it's being used for, and we believe we know whose hands that it's landing in. So that's really, really important. So you look at hard powers, and then you also look at soft powers. And soft powers is really where my expertise is more, I would say, than the hard power piece of this. But there are several areas of that. Education. So many of you might have heard of two separate organizations within the DoD and within the State Department. And these two organizations spend billions of dollars annually educating our ally and partner nations, and that includes Canada. So the first of those two organizations is the State Department. It's the International Military Education and Training Program, IMET. So for those of you who are familiar with IMET, you might first say to me, well, IMET's really about developing countries. So funding developing countries for training and to come to the United States and that type of thing, and that is true. But through IMET, and through our U.S.-Canada partnership, we're able to sit at the table collectively with those developing nations. We're able to learn together. Those of you who are here in school, those from the Army War College, we do that in those venues. And then along with IMET, which is State Department funded, DoD managed, is another program called the Regional Defense Fellowship Program, and you might be familiar with RDFP. RDFP is funded and managed by DoD. It again, in many cases, if you're familiar with RDFP, you might say it's developing nations also. Well, it is, but RDFP has more leeway that we can actually fund training and education for our Canadian counterparts through that program in two specific areas in the special operations community. We have funded from DoD through RDFP special operators, Canadian, to attend the Partnership and Special Operations Sovereign Challenge. And we also send Canadian enlisted, so NCOs, special operations members to our master's program at JSOMA, which is at Fort Bragg, and part of the College of International Security Affairs. So there is a lot of money funded there that brings those relationships together. And it really, we talk about, and you see it says relationships and networks on our slide. We believe these relationships lend to building networks, and it gives us the ability to really influence policies and decisions favorably to the U.S. and Canada when our international partners go back to their home countries. They are familiar with us, they have relationships, they have a better understanding, and it'll help them as they move into participants, as they move into senior leadership, to think about how the U.S. or how Canada might have done this, or what are the effects of those. I personally attended the National Defense University. So those of you from the Army War College, I was at one of your sister schools, one of the sister PMEs. And I was in class and I had instruction alongside of over 100 international students, Canadian, developing countries, European countries, and I can tell you firsthand, I saw it and I believe it. security cooperation works in this environment. One of my Canadian counterparts actually is still at NDU. He's teaching this year at the National War College, and he's teaching Americans and other internationals. So I would say that really is security cooperation at its finest. And we have similar programs, I'm sure, here at Queens College, and I know we have those at the Army War College. So what does it do for us, really, when we talk about all of these civilians, like myself, Department of Defense civilians, or military personnel attending training and attending class together? We really believe that going forward, there is a potential for the U.S. and Canada to collectively map and develop global networks of people and organizations to facilitate rapid communication, to identify risks, and to develop strategies in support of the Arctic, in support of our national interest, and support of our people going forward. So that takes us to our regional centers. Kathryn and I both work for the Ted Stevens Arctic Center for Security Studies. The U.S. actually has 6 regional centers for security studies, and they provide international venues, bilateral education, bilateral engagements, and allow us to have exchange of ideas in what we consider safe places. These regional centers are attached or aligned with combatant commands. So there are actually 6, and I'll tell you what they are, and then we'll focus on the Ted Stevens Center. We have the Africa Center, the Asia Pacific, the Americas, the Near East, South Asia, Europe, and then the Ted Stevens Center, which was instituted through the National Defense Authorization Act. We came into play at JBER, so we are in Canada, at the Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson. Those of you who have been to JBER, our office, we're still working on our office through our basing, but we will literally be down the street from Alaska NORAD, the Canadian Detachment, and Alaska Command. So we are literally right there with the people that we need to work closely with. And that really says a lot, because we've built it in Alaska, very near the Arctic. So we look at the Ted Stevens Center, and what's our goal, what's our mission, what's our pillars? We have 3 pillars. We provide courses through executive education, and we are building future practitioners through these courses. We work with Canada and other countries on partnership for research and analytics. We also have outreach and engagement venues like where we are today, which really allows us to get out, to talk to people. And we are working with our communities and our local populations to bring them into the fold, to help understand from them what we need to be doing and what their expertise is in the Arctic. So the Ted Stevens Center really, we believe, supports the U.S.-Canada relationship. A couple other things that the U.S. has done is we have announced that we are going to have an Arctic ambassador. I'm quite sure that Arctic ambassador will be working closely with both of our countries as we move through that. And I would really say that our hard powers, our soft powers, our security cooperation, it's a force multiplier. It's a force multiplier as our 2 countries work together. And we counter climate change. We counter those out there who have an interest or a disinterest in our national security and the security of both of our nations. And with that, I will turn it back over to Kathryn to close us out.
Yes, just very, very quickly. So our conclusions in our article are obviously soft power matters. And in the context of the Canada-U.S. relationship, there's a lot of potential to develop soft power tools, not only through some of the education programs that Lori mentioned, but also through the Ted Stevens Center. The tagline for TSC is a soft power complement to the DoD's hard power tools. So there's a lot of potential there, in particular for a robust research and engagement program. One of the goals of Major General Church Key, who is acting as the senior advisor at the Ted Stevens Center, is to actually establish a secretariat to serve the Permanent Joint Board of Defense as well as the MCC. So there's a lot of potential. So specifically with regard to the Arctic and the Canada-U.S. relationship, clearly the Department of Defense has a smart power strategy. Clearly the Department of Defense understands the importance and the relevance of smart power tools, but we're interested in pushing the envelope a little bit. We think that more has to be done to sequence and integrate smart power instruments, both hard power and soft power, into a real, true, living, breathing, bilateral Arctic strategy. And a bilateral Arctic strategy isn't on the books. We think that it's needed. We think that Canadian and U.S. officials need to start kicking that soccer ball down the field and start working on this. And these are some of the questions that we think are critical for us to answer if we want to adequately address the current and emerging risks and threats in the Arctic region. How can the United States and Canada engage more meaningfully to increase cooperation around mutual security interests? What are our joint goals and capacities in the Arctic? This third question, in my view, is extraordinarily important. What assumptions and cognitive biases underlie our understanding of Russian and Chinese objectives and behavior in the Arctic? In my view, testing those assumptions, revisiting those assumptions, understanding our cognitive biases are critical, because we need to flesh that out, throw it out on the table, know what's there, know it's real, in order for us to properly strategize in the Arctic. What are the strengths and limitations of traditional U.S.-Canada defense arrangements? How can hard and soft power tools be deployed to maximize bilateral objectives in both the traditional defense security realm and in the climate change realm? When should these tools be deployed? And in conclusion, a question that I thought about this morning: how can Canada and the United States collectively ensure that the Arctic remains a zone of peace as opposed to a zone of conflict? So with that, I'll end, and I'll turn it back over to Kyle. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation. So I'm going to give you the gift of an earworm. Let's get digital. So let's go online, and I'm going to introduce our next presenter. So Dr. Camilla Sorensen is an associate professor at the Institute of Strategy and War Studies at the Royal Danish Defence College. Her research fields include geopolitics, security studies, and military strategy, with a specific focus on China, East Asia, and the Arctic. Her presentation today will focus on the evolving Chinese strategic approach to the Arctic following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. She's joining us today from Denmark. Welcome.
Thank you, Kyle. And thank you also to the organizers for inviting me to take part in today's important discussions. I'm sorry that I could not be there in person to join you, but I'm grateful to the organizers for allowing me to participate in this way. So my focus in these brief initial remarks is on the evolving Chinese strategic approach in the Arctic. We'll talk a bit first on the Chinese interest in the region and how they have so far tried to secure, to promote these, using this as a departure point for discussing how the war in Ukraine could influence the China-Russia cooperation in the Arctic, and thus China's position in the Arctic going forward. These questions come at the background of a development over recent years where it has become more and more difficult for China to maneuver in the Arctic. There are general growing concerns about a stronger and more assertive China. There are these intensifying US-China great power, competition, rivalry that also increasingly plays into the Arctic. So there is in the Arctic, as we already talked about, there are this complex mix of cross-cutting global and regional security dynamics that makes it more difficult for China to maneuver in the Arctic. So far, in response, China has kind of taken what I, in several of my writings, have termed a tactical retreat from the region, a more low profile, kind of a wait and see approach, of course, minus in China's relations with Russia, where we can see a continuous development up, but I'll get back to this. But my point here is that even though we see this more wait and see approach, tactical retreat from China in the Arctic is still, or establishing a Chinese presence, Chinese influence in the Arctic is still a Chinese strategic, persistent Chinese strategic priority. So why is this? I think we can start there. I'll just see if I can move one of these forward. So why is the Arctic a persistent Chinese strategic priority? I will highlight three main specific but interrelated drivers behind China's strategic prioritization of the Arctic over the last decade. The first is strengthening China's Arctic research capacity and knowledge. This is still focused on gaining a better understanding of the changing Arctic climate, also in order to better predict and prepare for the implications, as well as in order to gradually establish China as a valuable partner for the Arctic states. This is what we often term science diplomacy, where China, as well as other non-Arctic states, seeks to use research activities to legitimize and strengthen China's presence in the region. However, I think the content and focus of China's research agenda has been changing or broadening in the recent decade, or maybe especially in recent years, as the Chinese domestic focus of establishing China as a leading power within knowledge and innovative new technologies have been further emphasized with the intensifying competition, especially with the US. Because in China, the Arctic, or rather the polar regions, that is the Arctic and the Antarctic, together with the deep seabed and outer space, are seen as these so-called new strategic frontiers. That is very challenging areas, seen as very challenging areas to operate in, resulting in a constant pressure, a constant urge for Chinese researchers, engineers, etc., that are operating in the region to advance their knowledge and improve their technological capabilities and solutions. So this being able to conduct Chinese research and other activities in the Arctic is therefore valued in Beijing, also for the way that it contributes to promote and raise the overall level of innovation and technology in China, which constitutes a key priority in China's national development strategy for restructuring and upgrading its economic model. So such emphasis on the Arctic as a crucial frontier for increasing China's technological level implies that ensuring China's access to the Arctic to operate in the Arctic is a mean in China's national development strategy, and the development and applications of new technologies in the Arctic therefore becomes an end in itself. So in recent years, we see that China has begun to conduct increasingly sophisticated scientific experiments as part of its Arctic research exhibition. It gives them Arctic knowledge, but it also gives them the opportunity to try out and further develop their knowledge and technological capabilities under these harsh and challenging conditions. And I think this is a crucial point, this about the Arctic being this area for trying out and improve China's knowledge and technology. Yet this is a crucial point in order to understand why, despite these recent setbacks, where we see this growing concern about Chinese intentions. I mentioned this tactical retreat by China from the Arctic. Well, despite of this, the Chinese priority of establishing China as an Arctic stakeholder, legitimate Arctic stakeholder, is persistent and long-term because it links up to the domestic agenda. And therefore, we continue to see encouragement in official Chinese documents of an expansion of China's Arctic research activities and capacity. There is even rumors that the Chinese will launch a new Arctic strategy, idea, paper, document. We'll see at the Arctic Circle that also just opened today in Iceland and will continue for a few days. So we'll see whether there is news coming out from there. So, of course, this knowledge, this technology developed in the Arctic has both or parallel civilian and military application, kind of this dual use aspect. And therefore, it also plays into the strategic priority of developing a world-class Chinese military. So this was the first. The two other main drivers behind China's growing strategic prioritization of the Arctic over the last decades are ensuring Chinese access to Arctic resources, assessed as important in order to secure and diversify China's supply. This goes for a broad range of Arctic resources, oil, gas, rare earth minerals, which the region holds in large amounts, and that are now also becoming more accessible. China also poses already has one of the world's largest distant water fishing fleets, and is of course also interested in ensuring access to the Arctic fishing grounds. And the last driver is promoting and securing favorable access to Arctic sea routes, which beside their crucial importance for extracting Arctic resources are considered attractive alternatives to the longer and strategically more vulnerable routes through the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal that China relies on now. And the general assessment is that the Arctic sea routes will not be commercially viable in the near future, but China, in particular, the Chinese state-owned shipping company COSCO, seems to hold a more optimistic outlook. And it's especially the transpolar passage or the central passage cutting straight through the North Pole, the blue line in the picture on the bottom, that seems to attract a growing Chinese interest. It's not only the shortest of the three Arctic routes, but its attractiveness seen from China is also that it, unlike the Northern Sea Route and the Northwestern Passage, it runs mostly through international waters, where all states have the freedom of navigation, and therefore Chinese ships would not have to follow the specific regulations of the relevant Arctic state, most relevant Russia in relation to the Northern Sea Route. Okay, so if we go to the how, China's approach so far has been to try to ensure its presence and influence in the Arctic by establishing strong and comprehensive relationships with as many Arctic states and stakeholders as possible, and by gradually increasing China's engagement in Arctic governance. And the main Chinese tactic, you could say, has been to offer benefits, specific knowledge, investments to the Arctic state and various stakeholders at different levels, who then develop their own interests in keeping China engaged in the region and in further developing their relations with Chinese stakeholders. Beijing has been, still is, keenly aware that China is the only great power that does not have Arctic territory and therefore depends on the Arctic states seeing benefits in having Chinese involvement. So in other words, China seeks to knit itself into the region on multiple levels through bilateral and multilateral engagements and agreements within research, infrastructure, and resource extraction, for example. But it is not working. China has not really had much success so far. I mentioned this overall intensifying US-China competition that increasingly plays into the region, the worsening relations, the growing tensions in China-EU relations as well. That also plays into the Arctic. And it has made it difficult for China, especially in the recent few years, to strengthen its relations to use this knitting strategy. So except for Russia, we don't really see this success in increasing China's presence and activities in the region. So do we see an adjustment? I think we are seeing an adjustment in their approach to an engagement in the region, including in China's framing, kind of the Chinese narrative of what they are in the Arctic. That is changing. We see now very little talk from China about this near Arctic state concept, about the polar Silk Road. So I think if anything, news comes out from the Chinese participation in the ongoing Arctic Circle meeting in Iceland, we will not see much of this about framing China as a near Arctic state or the polar Silk Road. But we'll see. That's just my guess. But this adjustment is a very pragmatic adjustment, where China is toning down its Arctic ambitions while re-emphasizing its cooperative policies and how engagement with Chinese stakeholders, including access to Chinese knowledge and technology, can benefit the Arctic states, Arctic stakeholders in dealing with the tremendous challenges they are facing, especially with climate change in the region. China also seeks not really to do activities that challenge the Arctic state. We've seen in their, for example, with their recent research exhibitions that they stay out in international waters. They don't try to apply to go into the territorial waters of the Arctic states, again, except Russia. So this is a way to kind of keep a low profile and not really challenge the Arctic states in any way. But all this, the other side of all this is then more focus from China on their cooperation with Russia in the Arctic. So this brings me back to the question in the title of my talk: is China going to take advantage of a weakening Russia in the Arctic? I think we are seeing signs of this, and not only related to China getting attractive deals on gas and oil from the Russian Arctic, but also on some of the more long-term Chinese interests promoting this establishment of China's presence and influence in the Arctic. Already before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw signs of how the changing balance between Russia and China played into the Arctic. In the February 4th joint statement, when Putin was in Beijing for the Winter Olympics, there was this joint statement between Russia and China. And in this joint statement, for the first time, the Arctic was mentioned. It said the sides agree to continue consistently intensify practical cooperation for the sustainable development of the Arctic. So again, this is the first time the Arctic is mentioned. It indicates a weakening Russian resistance. Russia has previously been very cautious, very hesitant to take in Arctic issues in their cooperation with China. So this is already a sign. I would argue that we are seeing a weakening Russian bargaining position in relation to China also playing into the Arctic. So what will this mean in practice? How might it involve? Will this include a military dimension? It's still early to say, but my preliminary thoughts here, and I would love to hear your inputs and invite more discussions of this. But my preliminary thoughts here is that there is a risk here, kind of an overall risk relating to the Arctic, that this development that we are seeing now, of course, related to the ongoing war in Ukraine, this isolation of Russia, the diplomatic, political isolation, the sanctioning, well, it weakens Russia's resistance, as I already mentioned, towards allowing China a stronger role in the Arctic. And where I can see that playing out in particular is in relation to Arctic governance. We already talked about how the Arctic Council is on pause. And China has, especially since its first Arctic white paper in 2018, been pushing, not strong push, but gradually mentioning when it has the opportunity that it also sees more international framing, more international governance playing into the Arctic that would give room for or more influence, a stronger role for non-Arctic states such as China. So if we are seeing, a stronger Chinese bargaining position in relation to Russia, an Arctic governance that is kind of put on pause, that is not really functioning, then this leaves more room for China to push for this, for its ideas about a more open international Arctic, this alternative to the Arctic Council, to Arctic governance arrangements that is kind of led by the Arctic states. So this is at least a risk I see. Whether Russia will, I'm sure Russia will not be happy about this. For sure, Russia has been very insisting on Arctic governance being an issue for Arctic states. But again, if we see this weakening Russian bargaining position, this could be this is something to follow. Whether this also goes for decreasing Russian resistance towards having a Chinese stronger Chinese presence in the Russian Arctic, more dual-use activities, etc. That's also something we should watch out for. So the question, I guess, that's really difficult to answer, even as I also really try to follow the debate in China among Chinese Arctic scholars on this, is how much of a strategic opportunity China actually assesses this to be, this about a weakening Russia, because it's also weighed up against if they really go and focus more on increasing their China's cooperation with Russia in the Arctic, as in general, then it could also have big negative implications for China's already deteriorating relationship with Europe and the US, that in economic terms are much more important for China. But I think the concern in the other Arctic states should be that if China first succeeds with Russia's more or less passive acceptance to establish an alternative governance mechanism, or just get it started, you could say, if it succeeds with establishing a stronger Chinese presence and activities, including militarily or dual use in the Russian Arctic, then it's there, and it's difficult to push out again. So this is a strategy we know, like gradually changing the realities on the ground, gradually pushing the status quo. And this, I think, we should include in our in the current consideration, in the current debate on how to deal with Russia in the Arctic, because there are these long-term implications, or risk for long-term implications for Arctic governance and Arctic security. I better stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Camilla. You gave us a lot to think about, and I'm sure there'll be some terrific, insightful questions once we transition after the next presentation. So I'd like to introduce our final presenter, Dr. Gaëlle Rivard-Piche. Gaëlle is a strategic analyst at the Defence Research and Development Canada, and she's currently embedded with the Canadian Special Operations Forces Command. She conducts research on a wide range of topics, including threat analysis, defense planning, and the Arctic. She will be speaking to us today about how competition among major powers has altered regional dynamics in the Arctic.
Well, first of all, thank you for the organizers. As usual, I know I'm not the first one to say it, but I know how much work goes into those. Really, je vous lève mon chapeau. I know it's a lot of work, and this has been so far a great event. So today what I want to talk to you about is how great power competition is affecting threats, and I would in the Canadian Arctic, in comparison or in contrast to threat going through the North American and the Canadian Arctic. And before I start, I just want to say that what I'm about to discuss does not represent the position of either DRDC, CANSOFCOM, or the Government of Canada, but this is the result of two research projects on which I've been involved that are leading to two books to be published in the near future. One with the Naval War College in the United States, and the other one who I'm co-authoring with Nancy Deeple, who's in the room, on the role of Special Operation Forces in the defense of the Canadian Arctic. And it's interesting because I think the two projects really reflect kind of my own thinking over the last few years. And so I came to study the Arctic as a defense scientist working for DRDC, embedded with the Directorate of Naval Strategy of the Royal Canadian Navy. I was, prior to that, an expert on Latin American post-conflict reconstruction, so I think it makes me a real continental expert or something like that. But overall, and so I really came to the region with I would say, a new eyes and very little knowledge. And what was really interesting about the Newport Arctic Scholar Initiative, which is called the NASI, was to, at the time in 2008, to provide new and innovative ways to foster cooperation, peace, and stability in the Arctic, focusing specifically on the maritime environment and maritime security. And through that process, we spent over 2 years consulting with other Arctic stakeholders. We were even able to engage with Russian scholars, despite American, I would say, directives around the lack of diplomatic engagement with Russia. And that helped us develop 30 principles around common awareness of the Arctic, confidence building measures, which we talked about this morning, as well as capability to promote Arctic and peace and stability. But when I'm looking at what's happening in the Arctic right now, and we're just generally following, I would say, the war in Ukraine, it is interesting and concerning because what we're seeing is that the most important concerns that were raised during the NASI consultations are now materializing. On the one hand, the United States has identified China as its spacing challenge, which really colors everything we're doing now when we talk about Arctic states or great power competition in the region. On top of that, as Will Grieve pointed out this morning, there's been the war in Ukraine, and I would say the suspension of the activity at the Arctic Council have really solidified this Arctic 7+1 structure. That is something that most Arctic specialists were very wary of while we were doing the consultations. And one of the key reason for that was that this Arctic 7+1 would actually push Russia towards China, which Camilla just discussed. And then on top of that, the Arctic 7+1 structure in the Arctic at the same time as the war in Ukraine, has increased the role of NATO in the region. And we pointed out this morning that although Canada has been a bit, I would say, cautious about NATO role, there's been a real change, and it started not on, of course it was, I would say, confirmed by the visit of the Secretary General of NATO recently, but that's something that changed from 2017, where there was an opening at the time in Canada's defense policy, strong, secure, engaged. And not only that, but now we're facing an Arctic 7+1, that is seven NATO countries against against Russia, which makes us think that cooperation as an Arctic state structure will probably be impossible for the near future. This is something that the United States actually pointed out in their new Arctic strategy that was released last week, that cooperation through the Arctic Council with Russia was, for the near future, pretty much impossible. Could change in the long term, but for now, it's just not an option on the table. So what does that mean when we talk about great power competition in the Arctic, and what are the implications for Canada? So I use this cartoon here, this image, because in military circles, when we talk about great power competition, we tend to focus on high order war, conflict, and I would say highly offensive capabilities and strategic capabilities like submarines. But through our discussion in my second project with Nancy, what we've come to realize is when we talk about threats in the Canadian Arctic, those threats are not conventional or even strategic in nature. They tend to be unconventional, below the threshold, and actually often non-military in nature. So what does that mean, and why do we have this reading of the current threat picture in the Arctic? For once, as Camilla presented, I think, a pretty good overview, actually a really good overview of China's posturing in the Arctic, and I would say quest for influence and a role in the region. And actually, when we look at, for example, their action and their rhetoric over the last year, the public one, it has demonstrated definitely that they're trying to increase both footprint and influence. And I would say it's important to recognize that the 2018 Arctic policy does not set ground for major concern. However, when we start reading between the lines, what we see is that there are important discrepancies in China's Arctic discourse, whether it's directed to domestic or foreign audience. And I think the work of Anne-Marie Brady does a really good job at capturing that. There's also a great report by the Brookings Institute on those differences in China's discourse over the Arctic. When we talk about when the discourse that's directed to foreign audience tend to be very carefully tailored, it refrains from engaging on sensitive topics and possible controversies. But when you look at domestic discourse, it tends to be way more hawkish. China will communicate its interests way more clearly and in more concrete terms. And especially when it comes to highlighting the resource potential of the region, as well as its own zone of strategic interest. And then there's the question of dual purpose or dual use capabilities and intent or activity in the region. And if we look at Arctic affairs generally, dual purpose and dual use technology, infrastructure, and capabilities make a lot of sense from an environmental perspective, and especially when we consider the challenges associated to developing infrastructure in the high north, and also limiting the footprint to preserve the environment. However, in the case of China, what is worrisome is the concept of military-civil fusion, where actually and the overall lack of transparency surrounding Arctic, especially Arctic scientific activity in the region. Under the military-civil fusion approach, China is using research and development endeavors to advance military capabilities and military technology. And it is not done in a transparent way, and therefore we can question what those scientific expeditions are for and whether they have military implications that are not being disclosed. And then on top of that, we've also seen in other regions that when China doesn't manage to get to advance in its interest to diplomatic means or more, I would say, and positive engagement, it tends to rely on coercive diplomatic tactics. Canada has been one of the key targets of that, if we think about the Huawei affair and the two Michaels. And so we can, I think there's real reason for concern when we think about how important the region is for China and how much emphasis they put on increasing influence and their footprint. And then, of course, there's the conversation around Russia, military modernization in the Arctic over the last 15 years, and what this means. There were already debates about Russian intention, which I think we can agree for now that they are mostly defensive when we talk about increasing military capability in the high north. But the situation around Ukraine brings a lot of doubt, and as we said, really diminished trust, which only feeds to a certain extent a security dilemma. But what is most striking to me is that while China and Russia have been investing and putting a lot of emphasis, I would say, over the last 10 years on the region, North America, the US, and Canada are just waking up to the issue. And there's a real reason, and I think there's a reason for that when it comes to Canada per se. Until very recently, and I think when we were thinking about the Canadian Arctic or the North American Arctic, the fact that it was not accessible was making it less strategically important. And but advancement in technology, climate change, the effect of climate change on access to the region have really made threats being able to manifest closer to home. And I don't necessarily think we're ready for it, especially when we think about how below the threshold and unconventional threats can manifest in the Canadian and North American Arctic, rather than simply looking at the Arctic as an avenue of approach or for vectors going through the Arctic to target North America. And what I want to highlight here is that from a Canadian perspective, we started having conversation about avenues of approach around 2020. Former CDS Jonathan Vance highlighted at the CDI conference in March 2020 that the main threats, the main Arctic threat to Canada was actually as an avenue of approach for Russian strategic vector. But then we also saw a change in, I would say, the language and the issues that were pointed out by senior officials from the Canadian government, including Ms. Jody Thomas, former deputy minister, now national security advisor, who pointed out in March 2021 that China has a voracious appetite and that will stop itself as nothing to feed itself. And that she was referring to the resource hunger, if you want, for Canadian resources. And then a few weeks ago, in front of the standing committee, the Parliamentary Standing Committee for National Security, Defense, and Veterans Affairs, CDS Wayne Eyre talked about how Russia and China are not just looking for survival, but expansion, and that they're posing these a threat to Canadian democracy. So what does this? Why did I include this in the Arctic? Is that when we talk about Canadian threats, threats manifesting in the Canadian Arctic, is that I think that for Canada, great power competition is becoming more and more tangible as through NATO, but also through the North. And then on top of, but we need, as a country with limited resources and facing these quite wide challenges, we need, first of all, to focus on when Canadian strategic interests are conflicting with adversary or other powers' strategic interests. So it's not only about posing China and Russia as an adversary, but by problematizing that relationship, identifying where competition actually will occur. The other thing is, especially when we talk about the Arctic, despite the fact that we're talking about threats, we need to move away from this peace versus war or peace versus conflict dichotomy and think about the Arctic, and I would say generally speaking, great power competition in the current system as a continuum of competition. Competition becomes more acute. Yes, war is possible, but I think what we're seeing in the Arctic is an intensification of competition, not necessarily a path to war. It's just the way we compete to defend and advance our interests that's at play. And so based on that, when we think about the consequences of great power competition in the Canadian Arctic, I would argue that the Canadian Arctic is more at risk of horizontal versus vertical escalation. What we will see are I assume, are threats manifesting at the gaps and seam of Arctic vulnerabilities. Since this morning, we've been talking about, yes, the interests of Arctic states, of North American interests, but also our adversarial interests. But we also need to recognize that the Arctic is probably one in Canada is where we're the most vulnerable because of lack of investment, contentious relations between southern and northern populations, systemic racism, and so on. And these factors can be exploited by foreign threats, by foreign actors through informal means, whether we're talking cyber capabilities, informal information warfare, and so on. Those are ways that adversaries can actually target us and in ways that will undermine Canadian strategic interests, including, I would say, social cohesion and our democracy in the country to advance their interests. And then that also means that not all threats are military in nature, because to target those specific vulnerabilities, you do not need military capabilities. And that also means that solution or addressing those threats doesn't necessarily go through military capabilities, and we have to have a bigger conversation and a broader conversation about how we can ensure the defense of the Canadian Arctic as a society, across a federal government, across level of governance and of governments, and also as a society. I will stop here so that we can have a conversation through the Q&As, but I'm happy to go in more details afterwards.
Okay, thank you very much, Gail. Really appreciate your discussion. I'm full of questions, but I don't want to use the moderator's prerogative quite yet. So let's look around the room, see if there's any hands up in person or online. Over here on my right, please.
Hey, so my name is Njord Vegge. I'm from the Norwegian Military Academy, currently at Quantico as an exchange researcher to Marine Corps University. I have a question to the last presentation here, Gail Piche. So I think Norway is experiencing many of the things you are talking about as well. For example, at Svalbard, we have started being more strict in interpreting how to regulate things according to the Svalbard Treaty, etc. But when you talk about China and sort of like the gray area, perhaps dual use, what would your suggestion or recommendation to the governments be? How should you regulate potential dangers or activities that are not in Western states' interest? Do you have any concrete suggestions to regulations or ways to go about it?
Well, I will speak to the Canadian context specifically, but one of the things we've identified is that those threats challenge to a certain extent the national defense, national security distinction, because they're foreign threats, but they're really manifesting. Often they're not necessarily military in nature, as I said, because we're talking, for example, economic activity or science and technology and so on. And so there's not a natural response. And I think it starts about what I would say left of the bag, or we cannot, if we're in a position where we need to respond, I think it's too late. It's about building resiliency, but also building joint awareness within our institutions and within our levels of government by sharing intelligence and also trying to come up with more innovative solutions where different actors can work together. I don't know how it would apply necessarily to Norway specifically, but I would also say that there's a need to cooperate, especially within an Arctic context, for Norway and Canada, for example, and other Arctic states to sit down and discuss those, I would say, newer or more emerging threats and challenges that we're facing, and how we can actually, as Arctic countries, detect, prevent, deter, and counter ultimately.
Okay, thank you. I saw a hand up over on my left here, please.
Perfect. Madeline Redfern from Nunavut. I'm glad that you brought up the issue regarding security being more than just sort of defense, but nonetheless, when we've seen one of the telecommunications companies said that this was just prior to sort of Ukraine being invaded by Russia, is that there's a huge reliance on the federal government actually informing businesses as well as northern governments and indigenous organizations and indigenous leaders about what those security threats are. So when Huawei was going to invest in fixing, Canada's northern telecommunications, one of the telecommunications companies was like, well, of course we're going to partner with them and we're going to use their goods because it's cheaper. Government of Canada has told us not to, and if anything, we have to, because the way that Government of Canada is investing in other competitive, telecommunications companies, and the only way to sort of remain competitive is to use cheaper, subsidized Chinese company products. So what we need to understand is the Government of Canada's own lack of sharing of intelligence, educating our business sector, or sort of directing about, what those security threats might be, or our indigenous leaders saying, fine, buy TMAC resources up near Cambridge Bay, that was going to be taken over by Shandong, because, our leaders said, well, we don't really care that they have a human rights problem and record with the Uyghurs, but, as long as they respect our human rights. I mean, that literally, that is the kind of discourse that we're having in our north. Problems with, like, you know, the federal government not stepping up, or if they're stepping up, they're only stepping up in Ottawa.
Yeah.
Not stepping up in the north, not stepping up in the business sector, not stepping up in Indigenous organizations, Indigenous leaderships. And that makes us incredibly vulnerable in the north, where you've just said, you know, where the biggest vulnerabilities are. So what do we do, you know, to try to get Ottawa to recognize it has to take that more progressive leadership role so that we don't have our businesses, our governments, and our Inuit organizations, our Inuit leaders not make these mistakes on behalf of themselves, but also not make mistakes on behalf of our national security.
Yeah. Well, I think, to me, like at an Ottawa or federal level, what it's showing is a lack of sharing of information. And when I talk about joint awareness, that's what I'm referring to. It's this notion that intelligence has to be shared, so that the the national security side of the house can actually communicate with the economy, like the foreign investment and economic development side of the house, like first and foremost, and then to be able to translate that information also to other levels of government and other communities and members of society. But on top of that, like following the comments of the keynote this morning, I think if we want an industry and like a growth strategy for this country, this will have to have a national security element in it, right? And not only one that is focusing solely on military threats or a very like clear national security threat, but one that really adapt more of that looks at economic threats and that has that's developed, like I would say, a pretty fine understanding and is properly supported to avoid those what you're describing. And I think, for example, a few years ago, if you were looking at the Huawei Canada website, the entire website was targeting northern communities, Indigenous communities, highlighting, like using cultural symbols on their website, talking about the right of all Canadians to access internet, right? And this is definitely a foreign firm targeting some of our vulnerabilities to advance their interests in our high north. So I think we need to rethink how we're approaching these issues, and that's why one of the reasons we really need to get out of that like conflict peace dynamic and foreign domestic. We need to reframe and that approach so that we can have more productive solution to the problems we were describing.
Okay, good, thanks. I'm going to ask Kathryn to talk about this from an American perspective.
Well, I just, I think that you're spot on, and I think the question was excellent. And from my perspective, what I'm hearing is that across the board, quite frankly, Canada and the United States are behind the 8 ball when it comes to the Arctic. And there are bits and pieces of strategy, but there's no big strategy, and I get it, right? I get it. From the U.S. perspective, you know, the bandwidth is only so wide. There are fires to put out in other areas of the world. There are only so many resources, right? Like, I get it. But to your point, other countries are going to be in a much stronger position to exploit Canadian vulnerabilities, U.S. vulnerabilities, and I think that people are starting to come around to the fact that we need to, I think you used the word progressive, I'm not exactly sure what that means, I would say proactive, right? As opposed to being reactive and ad hoc pieces of strategy, I think there needs to be a proactive approach to dealing with not only Canadian vulnerabilities, but U.S. vulnerabilities as well. And actually identifying what those are and seeing where there are complementary interests and working collectively to address those risks. Because I also think that it's pretty obvious that there, except for perhaps Russia, no other Arctic country can go it alone, right? In terms of handling these or managing these risks and challenges. My personal view.
Kyle, if I may also, I really like what you are saying about the concerns and the risks are not just military. And next on the block for the Department of Defense, actually, the Secretary of Defense has instructed DOD to open up an irregular warfare functional center. And what I hear you saying is those of us who are talking to the people who are developing this center, it is the economic risks, it is the food security, it is all of that that's not just military. It is irregular warfare. And from the DoD side, as this center moves forward, it's intended to work closely with our regional centers, like the Arctic Center, to address those types of issues with Canada and with our other allies and partners. So I would say that we're not there yet, but there is an awareness, and we're looking at what is the next thing we need to do to meet that risk.
Camilla, would you like to weigh in on this question if we still have you online?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. But I also think we should be careful drawing parallels between what China is doing in Africa or other places to what they could potentially do in the Arctic. The Arctic is already much more resilient. There is much more regulation of activities. There's much more agreement among the Arctic states, for example, on borders, on things like that. So I think we shouldn't underestimate our own position or overestimate what the Chinese are able to do. And another point there also is that I agree, and my own presentation was also on that China has the Arctic as a strategic priority. But it's not the strategic priority for the Chinese, right? It is still their main strategic priority is in Asia. And here they are facing a lot of challenges. So part of what I talked about, the tactical retreat, the more low profile, that is also coming from a more challenging near neighborhood for the Chinese. So they are refocusing, you could say, on their own neighborhood. All this is not to say that we shouldn't be aware, we shouldn't keep a focus, we shouldn't have this awareness, and especially I agree on the comments of prioritizing both among the Arctic states, but also within the individual Arctic states of sharing information, sharing intelligence between the different administrative levels. If I take my Kingdom of Denmark hat on, this is also a big challenge that we are facing, especially as we have these three different parts of the kingdom. We have Greenland, we have the Faroe Islands, and then we have Denmark proper. And that, of course, also makes a huge challenge for us because in a lot of areas, as you talked about, some is security, some is not. So on a lot of policy areas, research, communication, infrastructure, well, decision competence, decision making is in each of the individual parts of the kingdom. So Greenland take their own decisions on some of these things. The Faroe Islands takes their own decision. But if it's foreign security defense policy, well, then decisions are taken in Copenhagen. But how to decide when an issue becomes a security and defense issue. This is really an internal tension also in the Kingdom of Denmark. So I completely agree that there are challenges and a need to focus on this information sharing, intelligence sharing, and I especially see a potential for sharing between Canada and the Kingdom of Denmark, as we're already doing a bit, luckily.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the floor to see if there's any questions, either online or in person. Over here on the right, Rob, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Colonel Rob Arnold. I'm the Deputy Commander, Canadian Army Doctrine Training Center. So I think I'm going to build upon points that were just made and then reinforced by Dr. Friedman and Ms. Leffler. So I think it's an interesting point about the U.S. desire for a bilateral strategy in the Arctic. And it seems to solidify some of the points, or one of the points that was made in the first panel about the North American Arctic sub-region. So curious as to where that's being discussed, at like what level, and what Canada's position is on that.
Who would like to lead that one?
These, the idea, the need for a bilateral strategy, the conclusion of our paper, where there is a real need for a bilateral strategy, is born out of the research that we conducted, but also which has also been advocated by other Arctic scholars. Lindsay Rodham in particular has, I think back in 2020, noted the need for a bilateral Arctic strategy. So that's where it is. No, I can't comment on what's going on at higher levels and whether or not it's being discussed, but there is momentum, at least among scholars and practitioners, that this may be something that's important for Canada and the United States to look at.
Clearly, there's a precedent in many other areas.
Oh, God, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, right. And and a point that we make in our paper, is that, yes, all of our, our interests don't naturally align across, every issue, but as demonstrated, both, in the defense space, in the security space, in the trade space, and, virtually every other space that exists, we are natural allies, right? And where it makes sense to work together, we probably could and should. So,
Anything to add, Lori?
I think Kathryn nailed it.
That's great. I'd like to hear that. So I'm going to use the moderator's prerogative, and I'm going to pose a question to all the panelists. And what I want to do is draw in something that was raised earlier today by Dr. Greaves, this concept about reintegration, cooperation, or collaboration post-Ukrainian conflict. And that was specific to Russia. And then we all talked about competition. And Gail, I really liked your idea of the spectrum, right? Because it probably really exists on a spectrum. So are we well poised to have that dialogue? So in an East-West competition, are we well poised to have that? And is NATO the right organization within which to have that debate? And if you can answer, if yes, how? And if no, who? So which one of our panelists wants to tackle that?
I don't think NATO is the right forum at all, because we're talking, like, if we were to re-engage with Russia on Arctic matters, I think it needs to be within the Arctic 8 common regional interests. And I think as much as we need to, when we talk about threats, we should focus on conflicting interests. When it comes to cooperation and confidence, building confidence and trust, it's about focusing on common interests. And one of in the NACI book and the conversation, one of the issue that was identified is this: after after Crimea in 2014, the only forum where there continue to have cooperation between Russia and the Arctic states were the Coast Guard Security Forum, because of the needs that are associated to ensuring safety and security in the region at sea. And so I think it's about identifying where one Arctic state is not able to provide for itself, or and where there's this common interest. And we cannot forget, as Will pointed out, that Russia is 40% of the region. So if we want to talk about circumpolar Arctic, if we want to talk about the entire Arctic, we need to involve them. It's also half of the population. And on top of that, I would say from a Canadian perspective, if there's one issue on which we can probably maybe have a dialogue with Russia, it's on Arctic matters, because we are the second biggest country. Mm-hmm. And so Canada could actually, in the long term, I'm not saying now, but like potentially could be a broker of that conversation, just because our interests, based on our geography, our demography, are similar to Russia in the region.
Thank you. Gail, sorry, Camilla, would you like to handle that one next?
Yes. We just had released a report made from one of our former NATO ambassadors to the government, a report ordered by the government on the security challenges facing Denmark, facing the Kingdom of Denmark. And it's interesting what we already discussed, because in this report, it was pointed out that the Arctic could be the place where we first start to re-engage with Russia. So I think also I just want to stress that also in our debates about this, the Arctic is pointed to as the place where we could foresee, of course, things has to, not now, but where we could foresee a re-engagement with Russia. And that was also some of my points related to the Chinese, how this current situation leaves more room for China to push for alternative governance governance institutions in the Arctic. So we should take that into our considerations. NATO in the Arctic. Here I would like to go back to the talk about different sub-regions in the Arctic. I think in the European Arctic, definitely, the GeoGap, things like that, there's definitely a bigger role for NATO. But do we go to the more northern part, the whole issue for us in Greenland, especially about the Thule Air Base and the whole balance of this is not really, at least from a Danish point of view, we've been very hesitant about including a NATO presence more there. We think there's enough to do, but it also further complicates the internal dynamics I mentioned within the Kingdom of Denmark if we also then have a NATO dimension into that. So here, at least, I would point to the value of talking about the different Arctic sub-regions when we include the NATO dimension.
Thank you. Who would like to tackle this one next?
Happy to.
Okay.
So first, I would like to say again, these are the comments and views of Lori Leffler.
How many times do you
Exactly.
say that, right?
I would say definitely when we're speaking about our position with NATO. Some of the things that we really need to continue to think about when it comes to the Arctic, there are needs there. There are needs of the populations there. There are needs of the entire globe when it comes to our climate security, our food security and climate change. So the conversations need to continue. On the panel earlier, I believe it was Michelle that talked about the scientists are still speaking to each other. That's not something that is really out there publicly in the news, but that needs to continue to happen. So I would say we go back to our smart power. We go back to our soft power and our security cooperation and use avenues like that, like our regional centers, like the Ted Stevens Center, like the Marshall Center for Europe, and invite countries that we might not necessarily always be having conversations with into those communities for conversations. And we've done that with Russia in the past at the Marshall Center in Europe. So look at those soft power opportunities, and then also work with our other ally partner countries like Canada, who might be able to not have as contentious of a relationship with one country or the other, and work through the allies and partners in order to bring those conversations forward. Kathryn, anything to add?
Sure. So that's great, and I agree with your perspective on using some of the soft power instruments that we have. I'm actually, though, what I was thinking was actually pushing the envelope a little bit further, and I think it gets to exactly Camilla's point about governance and what the governance regime is going to look like in the Arctic, 5 or 10 or 15 years from now. And I would suggest that we are living in an extraordinarily unique period of time historically. And whether you believe that the post-World War II institutions are under stress or crumbling, or some commentators have actually gone as far as to say they are dead, right? Whichever view you might hold, the world is changing. And to your point, Kyle, it may be that some of the traditional tools that we have are adequate for bringing Russia back into the fold, or, you know, re-engaging with regard to cooperation. But it also might be possible that we need a new governance structure, a new governance arrangement worldwide to deal with the issues that are emerging in the 21st century. And my thought is perhaps the Arctic could serve as the incubator, that creative space for that to happen, and for us to create that new, the new world order 0.2 or 0.3 or whatever you want to call it. So we may be able to use traditional tools, but I'm suggesting that perhaps we may need to create something new and different to manage the challenges.
Thank you very much. That was great. That was really good. So I think we've got some great momentum going here as a part of this conference, and we're about to transition to have some lunch. Isn't that great? So I'd encourage all of the conference participants here in person to engage with the panelists, continue the discussion, let it go a little bit deeper, a little bit richer. We've established that it's not the official position of the US DoD. So feel free to challenge them and have a little bit more discussions. But please, all conference participants, join me in thanking all of our panelists from Denmark and here in person for their presentations.
Sir, you stole my thunder about announcing lunch. So it's the one good thing I get to announce today.
Tell us where to go, and then we'll grab our stuff.
But I want to just make sure that we thank you for the great input today. And so we have gifts for all of you. And then, yes, lunch is served over in the ballroom, and we'll be seated back and ready to go at 1400. So thank you, everybody.